touched on the issue of trust as being vitally important in this whole question of the relationship between, if you like, a civic society and good economic and political outcomes. There's research everywhere in this country demonstrating that Australians have lost trust in the system. The levels of distrust in our politicians is at record levels. The lack of trust is at record levels. We've just had a Royal Commission of Inquiry into banking and financial services. We're confronting something like 70, 75 recommendations out of it. You could say it's a good thing we had it because it turned up all sorts of things that people were horrified by. You could say it's a good thing that there's recommendations. But the issue, it seems to me, is that every time trust breaks down and we find that people won't do voluntarily what we expect them to do, we rush for the rule book. We look to coerce them. And I actually have come to think that there's quite a relationship between the breakdown of trust and the potential for the loss of freedom. Those new rules, the policing that will go with it, the censorious attitude that's developed, it will cost. It will cost. It will not be a good thing for our economy or for our society. It would have been far better if it had never been needed. The relationship between trust and freedom. Any thoughts?
Many thoughts. Frank Fukuyama wrote a book about this years ago, I think in the 1990s, and I remember being very struck by the observation that trust is a kind of social capital that some societies have and others don't. Peter just was in Africa. There are some African societies where there really is almost no trust, and one relies on the Kalashnikov rather than trust. I remember a friend of mine, a Chinese friend, saying, the big difference between you guys, meaning Westerners, and us is that your default setting is to trust someone when you meet them, and ours is the precise opposite. So I've thought a lot about
How long ago did he say that?
This was about 10 years ago.
I wonder if I hope he'd still say it.
Well, he said it in Singapore, not in mainland China, and yet he was from mainland China. I think if one looks at the decline of trust in institutions, because that's a different thing from trust in a stranger, there's been a steep decline in the trust that people feel in institutions in most developed countries. If you look at the polling on the United States, very few institutions have not seen a marked decline in trust over a 30 to 40 year time period, because we have Gallup data in the US going back to the 1970s. The decline in trust in Congress is very striking. I mean, it's been down in the single digits at some points in recent years. But you've also seen a decline in trust in the Supreme Court, and not surprisingly, perhaps the presidency, but that certainly predates Donald Trump. The military is an exception in the American case. Trust has actually risen in the military relative to the 1970s. Perhaps that's not surprising because the 70s was the time of Vietnam. There's still high levels of trust in the police. But most institutions have experienced a significant decline in trust. And amongst the worst non-political institutions in these terms are the banks. Journalists and the banks kind of vie to be bottom of the trust league table. Now, is this because people have, for whatever reason, withdrawn their trust capriciously? No, it's because the banks and indeed the media in most developed countries have lost people's trust by the way they've acted. I'm not going to get into the details of the Australian banks, but let's look at the biggest banks in the world and the ones that in many ways were the epicenter of the financial crisis, the American banks. They had behaved in a range of ways that were not illegal. They were compliant with regulation, or at least the regulators tolerated them, but the consequences for ordinary people were catastrophic. Not just because of the mis-selling of financial products that were bad, but because the whole thing turned into a massive systemic crisis that nearly blew up the world economy the way the 1929 crash did. We had a very close shave. I mean, you kind of forgotten it now, but there nearly was a Great Depression because of the way the banks were run. And I wrote a book about this, The Ascent of Money, and spent some time thinking about what had happened. And one of the striking features, and this goes to your question, John, about the banks is that they were actually the most regulated entities in the US financial system on the eve of the crisis. People had worried that hedge funds would cause the next financial crisis, or the unregulated derivatives markets. No, it was the highly regulated banks, which a whole bunch of regulators were supposed to be watching over. And it hit me as I was writing The Ascent of Money that the culture of banking had fundamentally changed over the 20 or so years before the financial crisis. From a culture which was based on informal understandings and relatively light supervision, in which you tried to do the right thing, to a culture in which you simply complied with the regulation. Are we compliant is a very different question from are we doing the right thing? I read a biography of a man named Sigmund Warburg, a really unusual figure in financial history because he didn't really mean to be a banker. He was really a scholar intellectual who'd become a banker because of the way the Nazis had forced him from his German homeland. And he started over in London, and he built a financial business, S.G. Warburg, that was fundamentally based on his own sense of integrity. And Warburg was the kind of person who, if he didn't like the look of somebody, wouldn't do business with them no matter how much money they had. Robert Maxwell walks into Warburg's and walks out again, and Warburg says, we will have nothing to do with that man. That scene in which a moral judgment is made about a potential relationship, that kind of scene had simply ceased to happen on Wall Street by 2006-07. The only question was, are we compliant? Can we do this? Can we do this? Is this okay? And that's a completely different mindset from the one that Warburg saw as central to a successful functioning financial order. The bankers in America, and I think this was true perhaps even more true in Britain, lost the trust of people for a reason, and they have to win it back. And they're not going to win it back in a hurry, any more than the media companies who've peddled fake news, misrepresented stories, opted for sensation over fact, any more than those media companies are going to win back trust. So let's not blame ordinary people for losing trust, whether it's in the US Congress or banks. They have every reason to have lost trust, and the institutions have got to win it back, and that's not going to happen overnight.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there, and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.